Oh, I'm very excited about this next speaker too. We have such a great lineup today, and we have Darcy Newby, and she's with the Overlake School. She's a licensed child and family therapist, a school counselor, and an art therapist. So, Darcy, we're excited to have you today, and please take it away.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me back to present at the NAMI conference. This is my second time coming here to support you guys. So I'm thrilled to be here. And it is such an honor to follow after Dr. Cunningham. And, it was really interesting listening to her presentation, and specifically the call for action is such a huge topic. So I feel like my presentation, I hope, will follow that as well. So, all right. So today is really about changing the way that we think about stress and how we metabolize it in our body. And so I love this quote. It is not the stress that kills us, it is our reaction to it. That's huge. So being able to think about, how our perception is varied. All of us can go through stressful experiences, but being able to learn different ways to react to it is really key. So today we are going to be talking about specifically our stress response cycle. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time focusing on the specificity of trauma, but more or less what is happening in our body, and really what happens within our children's bodies when they've gone through trauma. And so my hope today is I'm not going to give you a whole lot of new stuff with the stress response cycle, but I hope that some of this will be really eye-opening and give you some specific tools that can help support your children or support your students, support yourself really as well with how do you respond to trauma. I want to promote action and to give individuals agency to reorient their perceptions of trauma. This is a lot about the stuff that Dr. Cunningham was talking about as well. Rewire our neural pathways in our brain. And with children, this is exceptionally important to be able to do that. And lastly, being able to really reduce stress and burnout and promote resiliency. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So I love this concept, and I see it so often in the students that I work with. And that's the idea that trauma is really, it's different for all of us. So it's in the eye of the beholder. Trauma is relative, as is resiliency. So the way I think about trauma sometimes is, and trauma itself, the word is kind of loaded, because some of us can say, I don't really have a trauma narrative in the same way that so-and-so has it. But I think we can all relate to the idea. Oh, and I did not mute my phone. Sorry about that, guys. Still in the office. So really thinking about, we can all relate to the concept of trauma because we have all had collective trauma. Oh gosh. Sorry, guys. I might just have to unplug. Friday afternoon, sometimes crisis calls come in for me. You guys are getting to see me in action. So coming back to our presentation, if you and I were to be driving in the car together, actually, let's use the perfect example that Barbie shared with us. If we were driving in the car together and suddenly that rock hit our windshield, I may walk away from that situation and say, wow, we totaled the car. I am never getting in a car again. My body may feel in shock. I may have a ton of fear. I may have a lot of trauma. I may not want to ever sit in the front seat again. Whereas Barbie is doing all of her good CBT work, and here she is. She has totally reframed her thoughts around it and said, well, it was the windshield and not my forehead. So that's an important, I think that's important to remember, is that we don't get to decide who is considered traumatized or who isn't. It's all relative. The F words of trauma responses. And some of you guys know a little bit about the specialty school here at connected with Overlake Hospital, but I work with a lot of kids who love the F word. And so I thought it was appropriate to bring it into my slide today. And a lot of people know the first one being fight. When we are in an intense situation and we don't know what to do, and we tend to see this with our younger students here, they're more likely to act out in an aggressive manner. Flight is another one. When we can't, our body determines that we cannot necessarily address the situation effectively, we're better off to escape and get out. We leave the situation. Freeze is when we do nothing. And there's some interesting theories on freeze and how our body kind of shuts down. Actually, our brain shuts our body down to keep us safe. So doing nothing is actually a really healthy and effective response as well. I think that's important to remember that. And the last one is known as fawn. And this was kind of new to me. I had never heard this term. So it used to be the word appease, but now they're using the word fawn. And that has to do with how do we comply with the threat or avoid the confrontation. And I think it's important for us to remember when we are thinking about our students, we're thinking about our children, when we're thinking about ourselves with trauma responses, it's pretty typical now that we are trying to be socially appropriate. So our traumas are different, our threats are different, but we are still trying to figure out, how do I navigate this situation? Because I can't necessarily reach across a table and punch someone. That maybe wouldn't help me. That would have helped me back in the day when I was a caveman or a cavewoman. So our brains really have not evolved entirely. And when we are in a stressful situation, it is our kind of primal brain that takes over. All right, well, so I know a lot of people have like pandemic passion projects or little things that they have delved into. And, these 3 books were really very pivotal for me. And so my actual presentation, the whole premise of today's presentation, Stress is a Call for Action, is based on these 3 amazing books. So Peter Levine, who has actually coined somatic experiencing, he's an amazing clinician, psychologist, who really has studied how the body and how trauma is impacted in the body. A lot of you guys have probably heard of Bessel van der Kolk. He's definitely one of my idols, one of my mentors. He talks a lot. He's a researcher with trauma. And I love his speeches and his presentations because he's very much a realist when it comes to what actually works. And I hear Barbie saying she just read this book. This is great. I hope more of you guys read these books. They're really great. And I find them helpful for clinicians in the field as well. But Bessel van der Kolk is kind of an eternal skeptic. He is often saying things like, I don't know about that, or I don't know if that really is going to work. But I love when we can back theory with practice and specifically evidence-based research. So a lot of his work is based on evidence-based research. And then lastly, a new book it's not as common within, it's actually more specifically tailored towards women, I have found, but it is 2 twin sisters, Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski, who have Emily is a doctoral of musical arts and Amelia is a counselor, and they have basically taken a different way or a different theory of looking at stress and specifically burnout. So these were kind of my pandemic projects that I have a lot of passion for these 3 books. And so the goal of my presentation today is really to share these works together with you and to bring them into a nice package that you can leave here and you can say, I know what to do the next time I feel stressed or overwhelmed. I know how to support these children. So before we get into all the nitty-gritty, we'll just make sure we understand the difference between stress responses in animals in the wild and humans. And I'm looking at this picture even of this young child or this person, and it really indicates how much we are in our head, how much chaos is in our head. And that's kind of the downside sometimes to having a very evolved brain, is we are often in our heads. And here's a gazelle in the wild, or I actually don't know what this is. I think it's a kudu. I'm not sure exactly what animal this is, but here is an animal in the wild that could be prey at any point in time. And yet this animal looks pretty calm, to me at least. So Peter Levine specifically researched how animals respond to stress. And he said animals in the wild are not traumatized by routine threats to their lives, while humans, on the other hand, are readily overwhelmed and often subject to traumatic symptoms of hyperarousal, shutdown, and dysregulation. So I think it is important for us to remember that the primal part of our brain tends to be a lot more like a gazelle. This is kind of a heavy slide. There's lots on it, probably too much. But if you can take one thing from this slide, I just want you to read the title, and I'm going to read it really slowly so you'll hear it. Trauma occurs when one solution to a perceived threat does not work. So our perception of how do we solve this threat, when we get trapped in a threat and we cannot get out, we cannot go through to be able to have agency over our own lives, then we can get stuck. And if you guys have worked with traumatized individuals, or we ourselves have all had trauma, it can feel like a wash cycle in our head. We continue to kind of focus on, having our perception of the trauma continues to come back to us. Or we may suddenly go into a situation where we're having a massive body experience and we can't entirely understand why. So Peter Levine was inspired to study stress on animals. And so he actually would watch, I don't think I could do it because I'm such a lover of animals, but he would watch animals in stressful situations and would watch specifically the physiology of their body and what they did. And really learned some very outstanding new information. So what he found is that trauma responses have a lot to do with the third survival response, which is to freeze, to be stuck and to do absolutely nothing. And that is, I think it's really important that we normalize. Sometimes when we don't know what to do, we do nothing. But there's a tremendous amount of guilt and shame that comes in for individuals when they don't know what to do. So when fight or flight are not options, animals freeze, they immobilize, and this energy, this cortisol, I don't know if it's the same within animals. I know more about human brains than animal brains, but they really have a lot of pent up cortisol. And so what do? They have now, this gazelle has now been, a lion has taken this gazelle out. So this gazelle is not dead, but it's laying on the savannah saying, what do I do? How do I get through this? And the lion heads back to its pride and brings the crew. And there's a moment where Peter Levine witnessed these animals start to shake, and they would start to discharge their all this cortisol. And what he would witness was profound. He would see these animals nearly lose their life, stand up and walk out. So actually the freeze action saved their life, because if they were to continue fighting, the prey response of the other animal would kick in. That's important to remember. I think one thing that we have to be aware of is, as humans, we have now become socially conditioned to find normative outlets to cope with distress. So often we feel like we don't do anything because we can't necessarily speak up, raise our voice, say this isn't okay. So that's an important piece here. It doesn't mean that we can't later on work through our trauma, and I'll talk more about what that is. So Peter Levine said, if the immobility phase doesn't complete, then the charge stays trapped. So from the body's perspective, it is still under threat. When we do not complete the stress response cycle, that cortisol is still stored. And then we can't really move through it. So that actually leads to profound health implications. It's interesting when I think about the shaking phase to discharge the cortisol or the energy, that need to move your body, the need to feel within your body, to be personalized, to not be depersonalized or disconnected or dissociate from our body. It's so key. They've actually seen, people who have gone through surgery, when they are coming out of the anesthesia, will shake and they will tremble, or they will have like a shivering response. And Peter Levine claims that it's actually the exact same response. That's our body's way of diffusing the trauma. So I think you guys know a little bit about trauma responses. I do think it's important to talk about hyperarousal and to look at kind of what can happen with trauma responses. So if we were to look at a traumatic event, different individuals respond to trauma differently, and they can actually look vastly different. So it's important as practitioners, we begin to identify and recognize what is a trauma response, how is it showing up. And so sometimes trauma will cause our body to have a lot of hypervigilance and excessive hyperarousal, where we are very, very anxious and we are in kind of a panic state. So that continually being stuck on, we see that often with our students, not knowing what to do. It may sometimes look like ADHD or hyperactivity, but it could also be trauma. It's important to remember that. The next response too is sometimes following traumas, people feel very depressed. They may feel numb. They may feel like, I don't know what to do to address this. So I'm not going to do anything. It's actually safer and easier for me to shut down and shut in than it is to actually go forward and have agency over our lives. So in sticking with, since we're talking about the primal brain, we're going to talk a little bit about Siegelman's work on learned helplessness. And so a lot of you guys already know this research, and specifically on how animals respond to learned helplessness. So in box A, we have a dog. This was back in the day when they could do research on animals. That no longer is happening, but they placed a dog in a box that actually administered a light electrical current or a shock. And what they did is there was a small gate between box A and box B. So what would happen is the dog would get the shock and their body would automatically respond by jumping over this little gate that they had put in the box. So they began to learn that every time they would put this animal in box A, it would automatically jump to box B. And that was really because it had learned through trauma, we'll just call it what it is, or through an adverse life experience, I don't want to be in this box. So this dog had agency to move its body to get out of the situation. The next part of the study, they took, do you mind if we go back? Thank you, David. The next part of the study, they took the dog and they put a huge barrier between the two boxes. So the dog learned that it could not escape from box A to get into box B. They had essentially trapped it, and they would continue to administer electrical currents. And I don't know about you, but that sounds horrific. And a lot of people, when they are in traumatic situations, they are disempowered and they do not know what to do. What they learned, however, was quite shocking. They had assumed that this animal, when the second box was removed, the barrier was removed, that it would begin to then jump into box B. No, it did not. It stayed there. It actually cowered in the corner and it did nothing. And they discovered that they had to actually physically pick up the dog and move the dog into the other side to get it to engage and to get it to learn that it can actually be effective in problem solving. They had to have people supporting it. And it took so many more trials for the dog to learn that, okay, I can get out of this. So that's an important thing to remember, is when we have been traumatized, when we have been disempowered, when we haven't known what to do, it takes a lot more work to get out of that state of being. And I know this is, I mean, I can feel like we can look at this slide and think about what are the things, how does learned helplessness show up in children? Or how does it show up in us? How does it show up during this pandemic, especially now where, it feels like we've been at this a long time. So, and I say for myself personally, the students who are not showing any kind of excessive engagement are probably some of the more challenging students that I work with. It's harder for me to know what to do to actually effectively engage them. So kids may be sleeping, they may not be coming into school, they may not be engaging in the world around them. And I think it's easy as adults to we tend to recognize the students who are in the hyper arousal, who are maybe yelling or screaming or maybe stuck in that fight flight phase, but we don't always look for the students who are in the freeze or the fawn phase. So it's important that we keep our eye out for those kids as well, because they need our support. So I'm a therapist, as Barbie mentioned, and one area that I've just noticed of growth and shift in my own work with clients is really the way that I support kids doing trauma work. And I've noticed from my own work with students that actually engaging them to talk about their traumas has caused, and other clinicians would agree with this, it can cause them to be really emotionally flooded. And that it can actually, it could have the detrimental effect of causing more traumatization. Kids can be really resilient, and sometimes we don't always need to talk about our trauma to actually work through our trauma. So that slide where I said talk psychotherapy is not enough, we have to engage the body. And Bessel van der Kolk really highlights this in his work, and I love his work. So he says, one of the paradoxical necessities of the recovery process is the need to revisit the trauma without becoming so overwhelmed by sensations that we are re-traumatized. The way to accomplish this is to learn how to be present with these overwhelming emotions and really how to get into our body. I love this. We have to get out of our body. We have to get out of our head to get into our body to truly heal. That's so, so, so important. And the beauty of this is we don't need to rely on medication or all these practitioners who will continue to do trauma narratives and things like this. We can actually become agents in our own life to help support this. And a couple of things that Bessel found, and he was a skeptic, as I mentioned, one thing he discovered is that individuals who are traumatized benefited more from massage therapy and yoga than they did from meeting with a psychologist or a therapist, which I think is fabulous if we can give more people tools to help support them. And part of that is working with the body, calming your body, getting your body into a place of safety and stability, and also being able to move your body in a way that helps you feel stronger and empowered. And we'll talk more about some of his work with that. But I think it's important to remember that if we're doing trauma work and we're not including bodies, we're missing some of this. And especially our work with children. Children really, really need this. So I'm excited to be able to teach you guys some of these new cutting edge theories to help support the work, to support really our youth. So this is an interesting slide. This is a picture of an individual. She's a grown woman now. Her name is Bethany Hamilton. And when Bethany, she encountered a shark and had her arm essentially taken away from a shark. I can't imagine, this is a very extreme example of trauma and how one may move through it, but I think it's important to think about this and her, she's now actually a pro surfer. So she surfs with one arm and is phenomenal. She competes and engages, and talk about an extreme example of actually moving through her trauma. I myself don't think I could do that, but I wanted to share this with you. And I wanted to share some of what Peter Levine talks about when thinking about her situation. So that is that aggressiveness is the biological ability to be vigorous, energetic, especially when using instinct and force. In the immobility phase or traumatized state, there is assertive energies are inaccessible. So we don't know what to do. We can't do anything. We can't act. We cannot move. The restoration of healthy aggression or action is another word for it, is an essential part of trauma and recovery. So taking what happened to our body and actually finding a way to find assertion. Empowerment is the acceptance of personal authority. It derives from the capacity to choose the direction and execution of one's own energies. Mastery is the possession of skillful techniques in dealing with a successful threat. That doesn't mean this example of Bethany it kind of can be evocative. It doesn't mean that if you have been traumatized that you address your perpetrator necessarily, though sometimes being able to find your voice or to speak up or joining an organization that supports others, finding different outlets to move through your trauma. So finding ways to be assertive in your body, to feel powerful and strong. Really, we can't always change the way we think about the trauma. To move into radical acceptance can be hard for people, especially adults. I think it's harder for us. We tend to be in our heads more than kids, but we can access that trauma through doing something differently with our body. Even if we do not put our toe in the water after having our arm bitten off by a shark, we can find different ways to actually execute in our life. So I think it's awesome. It's neat to know. This is I hope I'm saying their names correctly. Emily and Amelia, who are the authors of Burnout, talk about something called the stress response cycle. And they think of emotions kind of like a tunnel. Emotions are within our body. They are held in our body. They're not necessarily in our head. We experience thoughts in our head. Usually emotions are in our body, which is a shift for me. I've actually been taught a very different theory. And so it's been kind of a cool shift for me. But essentially, the Nagoski sisters talk about when we enter this tunnel, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end with emotion. So it's really important that we actually go through that process. This was a quote that I just loved. And actually, Brene Brown did a podcast on their work, which is fabulous as well. The stress itself will kill you faster than the stressor will, unless you do something to complete the stress response cycle. While you are managing the day's stressors, your body is managing the day's stress. It's absolutely essential to your well-being that you give your body the resources it needs to complete the stress response cycle that has been activated. So finding an outlet is so important for our own physical health and well-being. And I know all of us who are attending this conference can sit for a minute and think about, where am I holding my stress in my body? Where do I feel it? I know for me, I have been staying up late and I haven't moved enough lately, and I really feel it in my back here. And I don't always think about it because I'm so up here and I'm not really in here. So take a minute and just kind of think about, like, what's happening in my body? Where am I feeling it today? So the Nagoski sisters talk about taking action. And, I'll admit to you, we have always, there's a lot of different things that people say when you feel stressed out, do this, hashtag self-care. We hear that all the time. And I was a little bit skeptical when I was learning about their work, but what I think is really pivotal, the change that happened within me and specifically over the pandemic, is we don't really address the stress that is held in our body by just solving our problems. If we could just simply solve the problem and move on, that would be great. But that's not really how our bodies work. We hold on to emotions, we hold on to experiences, we hold on to stress until we are actually able to physically release it. Children do this as well. This is so huge. I think children have more immediate resources to actually complete the stress response cycle. There's so many cool things that we're supporting kids to do, but it's been really limited with this pandemic. And when we really can't have kids engaged in a community doing this work, it's super important that we, as the caregivers and providers, mental health treatment teams, we need to make sure that we're actively helping to support this. So essentially, these are some basic theories or practices to try, which I don't think is new to most of you. But I want you to begin to think about, if I can give you anything from this presentation today, is I want you to kind of think about stress differently, that it is a call for action and an opportunity to move my body. So I'm going to talk about, on this slide, I'm going to talk about specifically, we're going to start with movement. And what is, we've all heard medical doctors say like, oh, actually, get physical exercise, that does more for your well-being. That's effective for children who are taking SSRI antidepressant medications. It's actually more effective. But we can say, yeah. What is it about this? The shift that happened in my mind was, I thought, okay, I need to actually I need to have the shakes, or I need to get rid of this cortisol that's pent up. And even though in my mind I'm feeling better, my body does not know the difference. My body still thinks I'm under threat. So movement, starting with that. And I don't want you guys to think that I'm saying go out and run a marathon, or go, make sure you get to the gym a couple times a week. Start to think about movement even in a simpler way. Even doing something as simple as a wall sit, where you are engaging your core and you're engaging your legs and holding that for 30 seconds and then releasing it. You will actually notice when you stand up from that, you have this lighter feeling. So that is the single most efficient way is movement, which I know is probably hard to hear, but being able to kind of plan in advance for that. I'm going to have a stressful day today. I will probably go for a walk tonight because it's a little stressful to be a presenter. But being able to think about, how do I use movement to help engage my body so I can release this? The second most effective technique is breathing, breath work. So being able to, if you do nothing else on these slides, none of these other 7 suggestions, do one. And I actually want you guys to do that with me now. And that is just by taking a couple moments to breathe. I think about how much I preach this skill and I don't often practice it. And so I would like you guys, even just for a moment, to think about a moment to pause, taking a really big inhale through your nose, holding it, and then making sure that the exhale is longer than the inhale. So when I teach this skill with students, I'll usually start with, let's do a 4 count in, a pause, and then a 6 count out. So I'm going to do that now. I think it's good for me to do this with you. And I encourage you at home, audience members, to also join me in just taking a big, deep, mindful breath. That's great. Thank you guys. So much better. So being intentional about immediately following a stressful situation, kind of reminding yourself to breathe, or modeling this, building this into your day with your children. And a lot of kids are like, I breathe all the time. What are you talking about? I do this all the time. But being intentional about it and trying it can sometimes be helpful. The next one will go into creative expression. And this can be an array of there's so many different ways to engage creative expression. I'm an art therapist, as you know, and so I feel like I have really been drawn into the field of art therapy because it is naturally therapeutic and it's naturally beautiful when you can use sublimation. So sublimation is the art of taking something awful or something traumatic or something terrible and actually turning it into art, turning it into something beautiful. And so creative expression can take a lot of different forms. It can be singing, it can be dancing, it can be making art. Pandemic, one of my passion projects was I took a master class and learned how to use household supplies to build garden beds. So I built a garden bed, a vegetable garden bed, which I'd never gardened before, and used that as my creative outlet. And every morning I would water it and I would see that it was changing and plants were growing. And it actually gave me a sense of agency that, yeah, I have something that I can look forward to amidst this pandemic. So as we're thinking about creativity, it's also neat to also learn that you don't necessarily have to have something that you can show for it. You don't have to have a picture or a garden or this. We can actually use creative thinking to feel differently. And an example I have of this is a student of mine had a pretty visceral reaction to a peer that was in their class. And, we have a lot of students who come to our school because they have had more extreme behaviors or sometimes aggression or bullying, things of that nature. And this student had had experienced a bully essentially. And we had decided, instead of thinking about the student like a bully, our goal was actually to use our imagination to think differently. So rather than seeing a bully, we talked about bumblebees and how bumblebees are everywhere. And bullies are kind of everywhere too. I hate to say it, but bumblebees are everywhere. They buzz around. Actually, let's say it's a honeybee because it could sting. And this student had been stung before by this bully. So we had talked about visualizing the student who's a big kid actually shrinking into this little teeny honeybee that would fly around, and sometimes it might get close to you, it might buzz, but we know that we don't want to swat at a bee. We don't want to slap a bee. We just want to notice the bee and kind of think about it differently. And even that little shift in this student's perspective shifted the way that they felt with the student, because then they would start to laugh, or they would be like, yeah, the bee was buzzing again. And so that's really a cool mindset to have when you can think differently, or use your creativity to shift that slightly. If we could move on, we'll talk more about some of these. Here is a picture of young children. They are practicing yoga, they are breathing. I think it's so cool to see this picture. I have students that I work with and I've never quite seen them this focused. But it is great if we can start by teaching our children how to complete the stress response cycle a little bit earlier. So like I said, we talked about physical activity, we talked about creative expression, we talked about breath work. Let's also talk about what it means to have belonging. And Dr. Cunningham spoke about this too, and how important it is to have a sense of belonging, or to have people that are advocates for you, and to be in a group. So being able to have a community that you connect with, a community that can kind of mirror you or will support you or validate you, that does a lot. And when I think about this, I think, gosh, how do we create that during a pandemic? How do we take steps to support belonging and fitting in? And it's a little awkward for me to be on a screen right now speaking to you guys, but yet you are all here today. You are here because you value mental wellness. And so there's a community within this little network here. So remember that, finding creative ways to think about, how do I support belonging? How do I support my kids engaging in the world around them in a unique way? The next one, so one of them is crying. And, this one kind of causes a little bit of like there's a lot of skepticism around, what does crying really do? And the goal with Nagoski's work is not to solve the problem. It is to solve the issue within our body, to release the cortisol, to get into mobilization, to deactivate our stress, to then restore, to support that. So crying, and I'm a big fan of crying myself, those who know me would agree, but being able to actually eliminate the stress through that process. And what people often will say is that I'm worried that if I cry, I won't stop, or I'm embarrassed. But what they find is that it takes about 7 minutes. Emotions can sit with us for about 7 minutes, and then we tend to move through them. We can move beyond them. So it's kind of a way of letting the emotion complete itself, or getting to the end of the tunnel. Being stuck there and not allowing our body to actually release that is more detrimental. So yeah, 7 minutes. There's interesting theories on that. And in sticking with these are short, little incremental things that we can do, you can support our youth to do. And I love that it is accessible. I know one of the barriers I've experienced as a clinician is being able to see enough people in my day. It's so hard to get in to see a therapist right now for I have so many friends reaching out saying my kid needs a therapist. And we as clinicians, I know there's a lot of providers who are joining us today, and really burnout is very real. Vicarious traumatization, we're holding the weight of a lot. And so being able to use these quick little 7-minute techniques is really profound, really pivotal. So sticking with short little incremental things, we can also do physical affection. Now, this is one that I have to be kind of careful with given the population I work with. However, it's neat when we can think about what actually physically happens in our body when we are held, when we are grounded, when we have connection with someone or something. There's a theory, and I don't know who coined the theory, but it's called the 20-second hug. It's kind of weird to hug someone for 20 seconds. It's a long time. It might feel awkward for some of us. And this may not be a technique that works for everyone, but being able to actually hug someone, if you have someone in your life that you can hug, being able to hug them for 20 to 22 seconds. And what you find is that the cortisol actually drains and the oxytocin increases. And if you're doing any sort of body awareness, you may actually notice these shifts. And even John and Julie Gottman talk about the 6-second kiss. And that is kind of that gives your body the message that I'm safe in this world, and that I have people to look out for me. I've got a tribe that's looking out for me. So that's really huge too. So we've got, laughter. Gosh, this is such a huge one that I love, is finding humor. I have a sort of a dark sense of humor sometimes, but finding humorous ways to look at small things, or being able to kind of shift into, we can't always laugh at situations, but if we can bring in things that make us feel lighter. When we laugh, that's our body's way of, and some people are saying things. I actually don't know if I can read all the comments, but I'm really excited for you guys to share at the end. But being able to use laughter. I love doing group work, because one of the most impactful things I've noticed is that when people are laughing, they are feeling good. And I love that. So finding ways to support laughter, whether it's memes. I think the internet has actually opened up a lot of cool ways to share. I love GIFs. I love memes. It's sometimes the best way to express emotions. So that's all Nagoski's work. Those 7 steps. I hope you guys take some of those with you today. And coming back to what the Nagoski sisters would want you to know is that physical activity is what tells your brain you have successfully survived the threat, and now your body is a safe place to live. Physical activity is the single most strategy for completing the stress response cycle. So we know this because doctors talk about this, but I want you guys to think about physical activity different. I can almost, since doing this work, reading these books, I almost think about my body and my cortisol level. And when it's like up to here, I better do something active. I better get outside. I better get out of my head and into my body. And so I hope that will stay with you guys. I hope you can think about kind of recognizing that within our body and seeing it within our children. They don't always communicate their stress, but you may see their stress is rising, or maybe they have a big exam coming up. Front loading that is going to be important. Being able to engage their body to be able to give them agency is really huge. So Bessel van der Kolk talks a lot about mirror neurons and how they promote secure attachment, safety, and connection. So mirror neurons are they're the part of our brain that looks across and recognizes that I am seen, I am heard, I am understood. I can feel like I have someone in my court. I can feel like there's someone who is relatable. And Dr. Cunningham mentioned that it's very important that when we're working with youth, that we can let them know we don't always look like them. We may not always be able to relate to their experience, but I can attend to them. I can mirror what's happening with them. I can let them know I see you, I hear you, you are important. That's so huge. So there's some interesting approaches that Bessel van der Kolk is introducing. And it's funny, I've talked with my staff team here at OSS about these techniques, and now the staff are doing things a little bit differently, which is pretty funny to witness and to watch. So one of the theories around mirror neurons is it's important that we do things in unison together. So singing as a group is considered one way to like trigger your mirror neurons, to feel like you're connected to a collective whole or a collective community. Drumming, being able to have a shared rhythm and being able to do something, creating something together. Singing, drumming, dancing. Yoga is something that Bessel still is saying, yoga really helps with the relaxation part, but it's also looking around the room and seeing other people that are doing things like you, that there is something profound about that. And he talks a lot about studying tribes and studying communities and studying the influence of belonging. And when we can come together and we can kind of model for each other that this is what we do, there's a lot of physiological effects on our body that our brain doesn't even know about. So as funny as it is, my team will sing happy birthday together on Zoom or on MS Teams together, and it sounds horrible, but it makes us laugh, or it makes us smile, or it makes us kind of feel like we have a sense of belonging. It makes us feel like we are relatable. Bessel is also talking about studying tango dancing in Argentina. And he has specifically spoken about how in that culture, during times of oppression, that they use tango dancing as a way to foster relatability, to release cortisol, to really give themselves agency in their life. So I'm hoping that he will come out with something that encourages tango dancing. We'll see. I'll keep an eye on it, let you know. So we're getting close to wrapping up here, but I noticed that when I learn about different concepts or different theories, I actually really appreciate it when presenters give me a little bit of homework or a little bit of something that I can sit with and think about. So I want you guys for a moment just to take some time to really reflect on a time in your life when you, or maybe it's even another person, viewed stress as a call for action. So what did you do to kind of move through? And I'm not just talking about a time when you problem solved. I'm talking about, I want you to think about a time that you saw it from the beginning all the way into the end. What did you do? How did you address this stress? And kind of think about that for a minute. We're just going to sit quietly, and I want you to reflect on what did you do to address the stress in your life using these techniques to kind of move through it. And then after that, I want you to think about how did you feel when you were able to do that? And I wish that I could, if I was with you guys there right now, I would ask the audience to speak up. That's way more my style. I love interactive presentations, but I'm not so good at reading the notes or the chat. So I'm going to share with you guys a couple of stories of shifts in my students that I've witnessed that have just been amazing, and especially during this pandemic. So as you know, many schools were not in person for a long stretch of time. And so we had a lot of students who we were really trying to engage on the camera. And a lot of teachers and a lot of clinicians and just practitioners can really relate to this, that it's very hard to actually get a kid who doesn't want to see their face, who doesn't want to feel like they're under a microscope, to look at a camera and to be present. We really crave human connection. So it's been very challenging to witness some of the things we've seen in our students. I've definitely seen more learned helplessness, more kind of hypoarousal. What's the point in waking up? What's the point in engaging? But I've also seen a lot of students who've really used this opportunity to create some amazing works of art, or to use this pandemic to kind of work through some of the stress and find agency over their own life. And one student in particular that comes to mind is a student that I've worked with who's actually taken, it's pretty cool. He has discovered that if he's on a screen, he can actually create puppet shows. And so this student has collected an array of puppets. There's a whole crew of puppets now. And he's actually used this to create puppet shows and images, and he'll record his videos. They often have a theme, there's an outcome, there's a protagonist, antagonist. He'll take this and create a whole amazing creative outlet. And so what we've seen is just amazing growth and amazing improvements, even though this is a student who, when schools opened, was not able to come in person due to the health and safety of his family and the limited access to vaccines. So he continued. He knew that we were here. He knew that we were on the screen. He knew we were rooting for him. And here he is. After we would go through our sessions or our lessons, he would say, "Can I show you a puppet show?" And it was a beautiful example of sublimation and just being able to work through. And people are saying their anxiety is better when there's a lot of things that people are doing now to really work through, this collective trauma, and to think about what they can do to have a healthy outlet. And I myself have really, I grew up doing dancing, classical ballet, and skiing, and I'm an art therapist. So I was really into creative outlets, and I still find in my adult life, honestly, I have to say, what would my child self tell me to do right now? What would I do if I was faced with this stress? And oftentimes it's get outside and get active, go do something that you love. So when you guys are thinking about stress, which there's a lot of big worldly conflicts that we have, adult things that we think about what your child self would do. I love to roller skate as a child. I still try to make time to roller skate as an adult, as funny as that is, but finding ways to actively address your stress cycle, address not just the stressor, but address the emotion, help yourself work through the emotion. So think about that. When you leave here today, I want you guys to have a couple of these techniques or things in your back pocket. I don't think it's probably anything really new, but it's a new way of thinking about it. And this is Bessel, for any of you who have seen him. And if you haven't, I highly suggest to go to one of his presentations. But his quote is, "The single most important issue for traumatized people is to find a sense of safety in their own bodies." And we as practitioners can do amazing work just by helping to support them using their bodies to move into a state of vitality, to move out of trauma, to feel like I have a voice, I have a choice, I can act. Doesn't mean that we necessarily face all of our trauma. It doesn't mean we don't talk about our trauma or our losses, because that's really therapeutic and helpful as well. But if we as supports to children are not also engaging them to use their bodies, to have a healthy expression, to have healthy outlets, we're not taking into consideration the whole person. So that is my hope for you today, is that you leave here thinking about, what can I do to help my body when I feel stressed? And it's inevitable, it's going to continue. And how can I support others around me? Thank you guys so much for your time. It has been an honor to be here with you. And I'm excited to get to connect more, answer any questions you may have.
Darcy, we do. We have one question. You'll have to give me a moment here. When I did the transition, a couple of things changed on my screen. The first question came from Tasha, and her question is: I've been working with youth with OCD, and the 7 ways of completing the stress cycle don't always work the same way and can actually frustrate them in the moment. What do you do to support a classroom, group, individual when you don't know whether a young person might have a specific anxiety or mood disorder?
You know, one thing that I really think is important is we bring students here, a collective group of students, all have different histories, different ACEs, different experiences. I think it's very important that we tailor our approaches to each individual student. That doesn't mean that we don't bring them into a community and say, hey guys, we're gonna use this, we're gonna try this. What I have found in my own work with kids is sometimes talking about what we're doing can have negative implications of, oh, now we're doing trauma work, or now I have to think about this. I actually just start doing it with them and beginning to actually model it for them. So if I have a kid who is under aroused, or maybe they're depressed, or maybe they are just sleeping in the hall and we can't get them, I'll say, hey, let's get up, let's get moving, let's go outside, let's get you some breakfast. You know, trying to actually model that is really huge. And I wish I could hear more about the specific behaviors that are coming up, or the specific areas of resistance. I would caution some students may not want to, if you identify that, hey, we're going to work through your stressors or your trauma this way, they may automatically stop doing it. What we do here at OSS is we have 3 amazing rec therapists who take the kids out into the community, and they just engage them that way. And that they don't necessarily know that they're engaging in stress reduction. They don't know that they're working through their traumas. And that's the beauty of it. It's so subliminal and so effective in just being able to introduce it and use it. And for parents too, if you're going to be doing something with your child, just even putting a pedometer on, you know, a lot of people have Fitbits, and say, let's see who can get to this many steps the fastest. There's different ways to engage kids. So it's important to get creative, I think, to do that work.
Darcy, you've taken us right to the bottom of the hour by 15 seconds. Very impressive. And a fantastic presentation also. We've had wonderful presenters today. And I know on behalf of NAMI Eastside, I thank you for your presentation today. And I'm sure we'll be talking to you again in the future.
Okay, thank you guys so much. It was great to be here with you today.
We would like to thank all of our sponsors for making this event possible. That includes our title sponsor, Overlake Medical Center, our benefactor sponsor, Kaiser Permanente, and our advocate sponsors. And that includes DNA, Catalyst Consulting, Teen Wise and Mom Wise, Sunday Bozeman, Black Mental Wellness, the St. Thomas School, Synapse, and the Baden Hill Group.